Welcome back to class. We are in Chapter 9.3 and we would like to look at a situation where the government budget is in red ink. So the government is running a government budget deficit and now a fiscal consolidation should take place. We want to look at how this shock is digested in the short run and in the medium run. So let's start the situation in point A, where we are in a medium run equilibrium. So the economy is reaching the natural level of GDP. And in the current situation, it is also the case that the inflation rate is constant. The inflation rate is not changing at all. Furthermore, it is the case that right now the real interest rate is at the level of 2%. So I have formatted the vertical axis a little bit different so that we also know at what level the real interest rate is. The real interest rate right now is at the level of 2%, but so is also the nominal interest rate. So I also give a label here to this LM relationship that the nominal interest rate is at the level of 2%, and right now we are assuming that the inflation rate is at the level of 0%, so absolute price stability. The only problem which is present in situation A is that the government is running a government budget deficit, and therefore the government is either decreasing government spending or the government is increasing the taxes. Therefore, the IS curve shifts to the left and the economy ends up in a new short-run equilibrium. So the interest rate is assumed to be still at the level of RB, and the GDP level is lower than in the previous situation. And this implies that the realized GDP is below the natural level of GDP. For the inflation rate, this implies that the inflation rate in period T is smaller than the inflation rate in T-1. And since we assumed that in the beginning the inflation rate is at the level of 0%, we can infer from this relationship that the economy is going through a phase of deflation. So the inflation rate is negative in situation B. We always assume that now, at some point in time, the central bank will react and the central bank lowers the real interest rate. Let's also stick to this assumption and assume that the central bank is lowering the real interest rate by 2 percentage points. So, of course, the instrument of the central bank is not the real interest rate, but it is the nominal interest rate. So the central bank is reducing the nominal interest rate from the level of 2% to the level of 0%. Thereby also the real interest rate decreases and the economy gets back on track. So at least to some extent it is the case that the economy is going out of recession and the GDP is increasing to the level YC. But this is not sufficient, like the central bank was cutting the interest rates, but the economy has not reached the natural level of output. The economy has not reached the same GDP level as in the previous equilibrium. This also implies that the economy is still in a phase of deflation. So inflation rates are negative. But we have not incorporated this piece of information in the upper part of this diagram. So let's assume that right now in scenario C, the rate of inflation is equal to minus 2%. So deflation occurs of the size of 2. Let's assume that in scenario C, the inflation rate is equal to minus 2%, and let's incorporate this information in the upper part of the diagram. It is the case that the negative inflation rate influences the real interest rate, and in case that the inflation rate in scenario C is at the level of minus 2%, then the real interest rate will be equal to a positive 2%, the same real interest rate level as in scenario B. Therefore, it will be the case that the GDP will not go all the way to scenario C, but the economy will stay on the GDP level of YB or YD. So when the deflation spiral is running, this leads to some problem to the central bank, because the central bank has lowered the nominal interest rate already to the level of 0%. The central bank cannot lower the interest rate even further, and therefore the central bank is running out of ammunition. The central bank has no ammunition anymore. The central bank cannot fire because in scenario D, the nominal interest rate is at the level of 0%. The big problem is that the deflation spiral is already running, and the only possibility how the central bank can stop this deflation spiral is that the central bank reacts fast. This is the only possibility how the central bank can avoid this deflation spiral. In case that the central bank observes this negative demand shock, the central bank has directly, like 1 second, 1 minute later, to decrease the interest rate so that the inflation rate will not go into the negative area. This is very, very important. This is a main learning outcome from this assignment, that the central bank has to react fast to avoid this deflation spiral. But when the deflation spiral is running, it might be the case that the central bank is running out of ammunition. The central bank is running into the zero lower bound of the nominal interest rate, and then the game is over. The game is over, at least for the central bank. In the textbook, you'll find this representation of the discussion of this shock. I think it is better in case that we look at the different scenarios in isolation so that we know what happens from the initial equilibrium to the short-run equilibrium, and from the short-run equilibrium to the final equilibrium. Let's have a look at Chapter 9.4, where we want to discuss the effects of an increase of the oil price. This figure stems from the textbook, and it is the case that we have two lines over time in this diagram. The blue line, this is the oil price in US dollars, and this has to be read against the left axis. And the red line, this is the real oil price index, and it has to be read against the right axis. The right axis is normalized in a way that the oil price index was normalized to 100% in the beginning in the 1970s. You can clearly see here the oil price shock 1 in the beginning of the 70s, and then the oil price shock 2 in the beginning of the 80s. And then you can also see here that before the financial crisis, the oil price increased tremendously. So in 2005, 2006, 2007, the oil price increased tremendously. During the financial crisis, the oil price in US dollars decreased to a level of 60 US dollars. So what we want to discuss in the following is what happens if the oil price increases. So we want to talk about these kind of oil price shocks here, which occurred in the beginning, mid 70s and the beginning of the 80s. Great. Let's model an oil price shock in the form of an increase of the oil price. We have one problem. We are working with a very simple production function. Y is equal to N. Labor is the only factor of production, and hence, to some extent, it's problematic to consider an oil price shock in this model. But we want to assume that an oil price shock can be modeled as an increase in the markup. We always said that the companies are able to charge a markup. The companies are not living in the market form of perfect competition, where price is equal to marginal cost, price is equal to the wage rate, but the companies are able to set the price of a product higher than the wage rate. We can either interpret this markup as a kind of profit margin, but we could also argue that the companies need this markup to pay other factors of production. And one factor of production could be oil. So in case that the oil price increases, the companies need to increase the markup to pay for the higher oil bill. So we are once more in this labor market setting. The markup increases, and when the markup increases, this parameter mu or m, the markup increases, and this leads to an effect on the price setting curve. The price setting curve shifts downwards. In the end, it is the case that the real wage decreases and the natural level of unemployment increases. So the shock occurs on the supply side of the economy. This is an important insight, that the natural level of unemployment increases, and this is a shock on the supply side of the economy. All the previous shocks we were talking about, they occurred on the demand side of the economy. How does that affect the diagram? We have to look into the equations. And here we get that when the markup increases, the unemployment rate increases. And we also know that when the natural rate of unemployment increases, then the natural rate of employment decreases. So the term in brackets decreases, and hence the natural level of output decreases. How does that affect the Phillips curve relationship? The natural rate of output is included in the intercept, and hence, in case that the natural level of output decreases, the absolute value of the intercept is smaller, and hence it will be the case that the PC curve will shift upwards. This is very important that you get this step. The natural level of output is smaller, and therefore the absolute value of the intercept becomes smaller. The Phillips curve relationship shifts upwards. Let's clarify this with a numerical example. Like before the shock, let's assume that alpha is equal to 1, labor force is equal to 100, and the natural level of output is equal to 1000. then the intercept will start at the value of minus 100. If, however, the natural level of output decreases, then the numerical value here for the intercept will be equal to minus 90. So the Phillips curve indeed shifts upwards. Let's analyze the shock graphically. This is the initial equilibrium, scenario A. The Phillips curve shifts upwards. So here you can really see that the shock occurs on the supply side of the economy, because in a first step, the upper part of the diagram is not affected. So it's not the demand side, it's not the IS curve which shifts in the beginning, but it's in the lower part of the diagram, the Phillips curve. The Phillips curve shifts upwards because the markup M or mu increases, and therefore we can directly see what happens in the new short-run equilibrium. The companies are increasing the markup. When the companies increase the markup, this will lead to higher goods prices and therefore also will lead to a higher rate of inflation. So in the new short-run equilibrium, it is the case that the inflation rate picks up. The inflation rate is now larger than in the previous year, and hence the economy has an inflation problem. Let's summarize the effects in the new short-run equilibrium. It is a case that initially GDP has not changed. The GDP level in scenario B is equal to the GDP level in scenario A. Also, employment has not changed, but now the unemployment rate is lower than the natural rate. We have a new natural rate of unemployment, and the realized unemployment rate is lower than the natural rate of unemployment. The inflation rate will increase over time, so the inflation rate in year T is larger than in the previous year. This is very important to understand why this is the case. The companies, they have to pay for the higher oil price bill, and hence they will rise the goods prices, and this will lead to inflation. The inflation rate is higher in year T compared to the previous year. This will also be the case in the next periods. So also in the period T+1, the inflation rate will be higher than in period T, and in T+2, the inflation rate will be higher than in T+1. So the economy has a problem with respect to price stability. And at some point in time, the central bank will react and will increase the real interest rate so that the LM curve shifts upwards. Let's analyze this action of the central bank in the diagram you're already familiar with. We are right now in scenario B. The inflation rate increases over time, and the economy has a problem with respect to price stability. In a first step, it is very important that we understand where the new medium-run equilibrium will be. It will be where the Phillips curve intersects with the horizontal axis. So this point here, the GDP level Y and C, will be the new equilibrium level of output in scenario C. When we know this point here, we also know by how much the central bank has to increase the interest rate. So the central bank has to increase the interest rate by this distance here. Only this amount of increase of the interest rate is enough so that in the end the inflation rate is constant, so that the inflation rate does not change even further. So the interest rate, the central bank has to increase the interest rate to the level RC, and then it will be the case that the economy will slide down along this Phillips curve into this new equilibrium here. This increase of the real interest rate leads to a decrease of demand for investment goods, and hence it is the case that goods demand is affected over time, and we are getting in this new equilibrium in point C. Let's also summarize the medium-run equilibrium, the scenario C. From B to C, output is decreasing, but inflation rate is still increasing. So we are living in a scenario which is called stagflation. So stagnation and inflation. We are living in a world where the economy is contracting, but inflation is still picking up. When we compare the initial equilibrium with the new medium-run equilibrium, it is the case that GDP decreased. This is the case because we were looking at a supply shock. Employment in scenario C is lower than the employment in scenario A. The new unemployment rate in scenario C is equal to the new natural level of unemployment, and hence inflation does not change anymore. In scenario C, it is also the case that the inflation is constant. The inflation rate does not pick up anymore. But what is also very important is that we are understanding that the inflation rate in scenario C is higher than the inflation rate in scenario A. This is the case because of the fact that during the whole adjustment process, the realized level of GDP was higher than the new natural level of GDP, and therefore the inflation rate increased, inflation rate increased, inflation rate increased. So in scenario C, the inflation rate is higher than in scenario A. In case that the central bank wants to reduce the inflation rate, then the real interest rate has to increase even more. The real interest rate has to be higher than the real interest rate level RC. This implies that when the central bank wants to bring down the inflation rate, the economy has to go through a phase of recession. This is the end of Chapter 9. Thank you for watching this video. Have a nice day. Bye bye.